Today I'll be revealing some of the most chilling remnants of World War II, from eerie bunkers to sunken wrecks beneath the sea. Get ready to hear about the war's darkest secrets, including bizarre breeding experiments and even Hitler's surprising Christmas carols. The rise of the Fourth Reich. Did you know that the Nazi Party almost made a major comeback after World War II? That's right, it's true. In the years following the war, a man named Werner Naumann tried to establish the Fourth Reich, nearly plunging the world into chaos again. It's amazing that hardly anybody today knows of this guy. He was the state secretary of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda for the Nazi Party. That was the organization responsible for controlling pretty much everything the German people saw and heard. News, literature, films, music, radio, etc. It was all controlled by Werner Naumann and jam-packed full of Nazi propaganda. Let's go back even earlier though, to Werner's youth. As a young man, he studied law and political science. In 1928, Werner became a member of the Nazi Party. By 1936, he had earned himself a doctorate. Starting in 1938, he worked directly alongside one of the foulest men of the 20th century. I'm talking about Paul Joseph Goebbels, one of Hitler's closest followers. Goebbels was essentially an apostle of the Führer. Throughout the war, Werner Naumann rose through the ranks. He became so important that Adolf Hitler named him the successor to Goebbels in his will. How crazy is it to think Hitler took the time to write an actual will detailing the line of succession in case of his death? Then came Hitler's end in April of 1944. The world celebrated and the highest Nazi officials scattered like rats. Werner escaped the Führer bunker, fled and found work on a farm. He went from being a prince in the Nazi regime to shoveling manure. He may have stayed there if it hadn't been for the controversial amnesty law that took effect in 1950. The amnesty law applied to about 800,000 people who had been part of the Nazi war machine. Nazi officials and even members of the SS were suddenly allowed to return home and shed their false identities. This was where the trouble began. Werner Naumann put down the manure shovel and started reaching out to former Nazi comrades. Soon he had established a network of around 1,000 former members. With their help, he started to build an underground organization. This was extremely secretive. Members of the underground Nazi Party included officials still hiding in countries like Spain and Argentina. The goal was to re-emerge in the political landscape once the dust had settled. Then a new Nazi party would be formed. This would be the Fourth Reich, a continuation of Hitler's failed ideas. The way this went about being enacted was seriously clever. It's something that should be studied in schools for how devious it was. Keep watching to see how it ended for the second wave Nazis. Creepy sunken Nazi wreckage. At the bottom of the South Pacific Ocean, scientists found the final resting place of a legendary aircraft carrier that sank in 1942. This thing is spooky to say the least. Just check out these pictures of the wreck, like this one of the anti-aircraft gun looking as if it's still trying to target Japanese aircraft. And here's a picture of an F-4 Wildcat fighter sitting on the ocean floor within the carrier's field of debris. All the images are courtesy of Paul G. Allen's Vulcan Incorporated. This sunken ship is the USS Hornet, lying almost perfectly upright at an astounding depth of 17,500 feet. It was located late in January 2019 off the edge of the Solomon Islands by the research vessel Petrel. It's so deep that the ship has hardly deteriorated over the last 8 decades. When you're at a depth of almost 20,000 feet, you don't really get a lot of life forms clinging to giant scrap heaps. The USS Hornet almost looks like a toy ship sitting at the bottom of a murky bathtub, totally untouched by time. As for how it sank, that is a story and a half. It was one of the most intense battles of the Pacific Theater, though to be honest, they were all intense. On October 26, 1942, the USS Hornet was defending itself from a seemingly endless bombardment of Japanese aircraft. This was in the middle of the Battle of Santa Cruz Island, with Japanese bombs falling from the sky like oversized hail balls. The crew of the Hornet, about 2,000 strong, was forced to abandon ship when they couldn't put out the numerous fires. Even as they were fleeing, the Japanese kept bombing. 4 rapid torpedoes crashed into the side of the carrier and sank it. Sadly, 111 crew members lost their lives in the battle. To find the wreckage, The scientific team aboard the RV Petrel used old information logs and action reports from the battle. They got a general idea of where the ship sank, found it on the sonar, then sent an underwater vehicle to take pictures. And now for number 10. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to Kimi Zuhara and Cameron Moved. Thanks so much for watching and supporting OE. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Bunker of Horror. A bunker has been found in northeast China filled to its brim with unimaginable horrors. You're going to be disturbed and intrigued by this sad ruin. The bunker may have been the biggest test site of the infamous Unit 731. Some say Japan's Unit 731 was even worse than any Nazi unit when it came to inhuman experiments. This shocking bunker was uncovered in Heilongjiang province near the city of Anda. It was built in 1941 by the Japanese and remained in use until World War II was over. The evil and villainous Unit 731 had already been around for a decade by then. They got their beginning in 1931 as a public health unit, but as Japan descended deeper into a spiral of war-induced madness, the health unit expanded to include chemical and biological experiments. These experiments were typically carried out on captives from anywhere. It didn't matter to the Japanese scientists. Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Russia, or America. As for precisely what experiments were carried out, that's a sensitive subject. I'm going to tell you about a few of them, but keep in mind they are troubling, sadistic, and downright diabolical. Around 12,000 people were experimented on by Unit 731. They tested bacterial bombs, grenades, flamethrowers, X-rays, and even experimented with the plague. Unit 731 cultivated fleas infected with the plague, and then dropped thousands of them like a mist of locusts from planes over China, causing devastating outbreaks. They also did sickening experiments like injecting people with animal blood to see what would happen. Not much of the bunker remains. It's a partially destroyed U-shaped structure that is still mostly buried beneath the ground. It appears to be about 108 feet long, with chambers connected by a lengthy tunnel. Archaeologists with the Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology haven't stepped inside yet, so I can't show you what it looks like within the bunker. But they believe that when they do enter, they'll find dissection rooms, dining areas, and the laboratories where unspeakable things happened. The tank that could fly. How would you like to get behind the wheel of a flying tank? This was likely the question the inventor of the Antonov A40 asked when trying to get funding for his crazy idea. The Antonov A40 was the very first flying tank in the world, though it's not exactly what you're picturing. It flew, but it didn't have a propeller, and it wasn't exactly an airplane. In World War II, Soviet engineers were desperate for a way to drop their tanks into the middle of the battlefield. It took too long to get a tank from the factory to the front lines. If only they had some way to fly tanks rapidly to where they were needed. This sort of technology would have been a big strategic advantage. Other nations were also trying to figure out how to deploy tanks in a more timely manner. One of the solutions was to stick a tank on a glider, but it wasn't very effective. The Soviets strapped T-27 tanks, which were pretty small, onto the bottoms of heavy bombers and landed them on airfields. But they wanted something better. Oleg Antonov was the man in charge of the flying tank. The man with the plan, if you will. He designed a mix between a biplane and a T-60 light tank. The vehicle had a detachable wood cradle and was equipped with canvas wings. The genius part of the design was that the tank didn't fly itself. It had to be towed by a heavy transport plane like a Tupolev TB3. But how do you tow something in the air? Well, you give it wings and hope it stays in the air when the plane with the propeller takes off. Only one test was conducted on the flying tank, and it turned out to be a partial disaster. On September 2nd, 1942, a TB3 bomber tried to tow the Antonov A40. But towing things in the air is hard, and the bomber had to ditch the tank or it would have crashed. The level of drag was too much, causing the bomber to overheat. The only good part was that once the bomber let go of the flying tank, the glider section worked perfectly. The tank glided all the way to the ground, and the pilot, driver, I'm not sure what you'd call the person behind the wheel of this thing, got the tank back to base in one piece. It was a good idea, but the Soviets shelved it. To this day, the Antonov A-40 is one of the craziest Soviet inventions in history. The end of the Fourth Reich. Let's check in with Werner Naumann, the old buddy of Adolf Hitler. In 1950, he set about infiltrating German political parties such as the Free Democratic Party, the German Party, and the All-German Bloc, all to re-establish the Nazis. However, he ignored the Socialist Reich Party because they were Nazis. Werner was still a Nazi at heart, but he knew there was no way the party could get back into power without doing it stealthily and piggybacking on the popularity of a less extremist political entity. To understand how something like this was possible, you need to learn about the denazification procedures that were enacted in 1945. This is a major piece of history few are aware of. The war was over, but the Nazis were not even close to being extinct. With Hitler dead and the war ended, some Nazis were put in jail, forced to pay a fine, or banned from participating in politics, but not all of them. That only happened to a handful of people who were seen as particularly terrible. The rest of the Nazi members were exonerated. Many of them became attached to other political parties like the Federal Democratic Party. To put it in more modern terms, it would be like if the Republican Party was disbanded in America right now, but instead of retiring, Republicans joined a different party with a different name. Nothing really changed, same engine, different paint job. Then at the end of 1950, denazification was terminated. Former Nazis were suddenly allowed to join parties when before they'd been banned from politics. In 1951, the Federal Democratic Party, filled with ex-Nazis, demanded war criminals be released from jail. They also established the German Soldiers Association to give former SS and members a doorway into the political landscape. If gone unchecked, this could have resulted in Werner's Fourth Reich coming to fruition, but the British weren't having it. British security forces had been secretly surveilling Werner Naumann and his underground organization. In early January 1953, the British arrested Werner and 6 other members of his Nazi club. There wasn't much the British could do with him in the end, though. Werner was released and he went on to run for office. But not surprisingly, he failed miserably. He never ran for government again and died in 1982. It's this last bit of information that I think is going to shock you the most. There was a massive investigation into the allegations that the FDP, the Federal Democratic Party, had been infiltrated by former Nazi members. However, there was no purge. The vast majority of ex-Nazis who had infiltrated the organization, either on the orders of Werner or just because they wanted to, were left in place. Moving forward in time almost 80 years, the Free Democratic Party is currently a major liberal political party in Germany. So, could it still be infiltrated by Nazis? Let me know what you think in the comments. Panic evacuation and a forgotten bomb. In February 2024, the town of Plymouth was brought to a standstill. After a father wandered into his daughter's garden, a massive evacuation took place. One of the largest peacetime evacuations in British history. This is the story about Ian Jari's accidental discovery of an unexploded bomb from World War II. Ian thought it was just going to be another day working with his daughter in her garden when he hit something hard with the tip of his spade. He wasn't sure what exactly it was, only that it was big. Over the next week, Ian kept revealing more and more of the bomb, clearing dirt away in an attempt to identify what he'd discovered. He still didn't know for sure if the mystery object was a bomb, but Ian was growing more concerned with each bit of the thing he revealed. It was only when Ian's wife suggested that he should just call the cops that the authorities got involved. 5 minutes after the call, police were cordoning off the area. 16 cop cars swarmed the neighborhood, followed by the explosive ordnance disposal unit. To those who didn't know what was going on, it looked like the apocalypse had started. The city soon spiraled into chaos. A severe government alert was sent to people's phones, telling them to stay away from the area between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. It was only a warning, but it was enough to freak people out. 10,000 residents were asked to leave their homes as the unexploded bomb was transported through the city. The experts weren't about to blow the bomb up in the garden, because this thing was big. It weighed 1,100 pounds, and its explosive potential was humongous. Everyone in the vicinity of the route taken by the disposal convoy had to leave. You know, just in case the bomb exploded as it was being driven through the city streets. Ian Jari may have been the most freaked out of everybody. He had been banging on the mystery object with his spade as if he discovered a buried pirate treasure chest. But nope, it was a bomb that could have left a crater where his house used to be. Let's be thankful the bomb didn't accidentally detonate. It was removed, disposed of, and eventually everybody was allowed back into their homes. Adolf Hitler's Christmas jingle. I'm going to tell you something now that you've likely never heard before. Adolf Hitler came up with his very own version of one of the most famous songs in the world. And it's a song you yourself may have sung hundreds of times. Silent Night is one of the most well-known Christmas tunes. Next to maybe Grandma got run over by a reindeer.
Grandma got run over by a reindeer, walking home from our house Christmas Eve.
But what you might not know is that Silent Night was written over 200 years ago by Joseph Moore. The very first performance was on Christmas Eve 1818 in the small village of Oberndorf, Austria. Only then it was called Stille Nacht, and it wasn't sung in English. The Christmas carol has been translated into more than 135 languages. The English version you may be familiar with today was published by an Episcopal priest named John Freeman Young. He started singing it while serving at the Trinity Church in New York in 1859. In 1935, Bing Crosby's version shook the stockings loose across America. It sold more than 10 million copies to date. But just how many copies has Hitler's version sold? I sadly don't have any exact figures to share with you, but I think it's safe to say likely not nearly as many as Bing Crosby's version. Here's a picture of Hitler in a festive setting. The Nazis didn't like Christmas for one main reason. Jesus was a Jew, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Nazi stance on Judaism. But the Nazis couldn't just get rid of Christmas, seeing as it was practiced by so many Germans. Killing Christmas would have been a political catastrophe. Hitler took a page from Christianity's own playbook. He would keep the tradition that so many people love, but tweak it to be less about Jesus and more about him. It was like how Christianity took ancient pagan winter festivals and, instead of abolishing them, changed them to be more about Jesus. In the 1930s and 40s, the Nazis quietly went about transforming Christmas culture. They infused Christmas with Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism. They did this a number of ways. Instead of putting a star on the tree, Germans would put a swastika on the tree. Instead of having decorations of Jesus and his mother Mary, people could display decorations of an ordinary mother and child, but only as long as they were both blonde and had blue eyes. Instead of celebrating the coming of Jesus, the Nazis changed Christmas to be a celebration of the coming of the Führer. Instead of Santa sliding down the chimney with a sack of toys, it was Hitler coming down the chimney with a machine gun. And then came the changes to the Christmas carols. Hitler hired an expert to change some of the words to Silent Night, like this passage you've likely heard a million times. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Hitler had it changed to, only the Chancellor stays on guard, Germany's future to watch and to ward, guiding our nation all right. It doesn't even kind of sound the same. The name changed from Silent Night to Exalted Night. It's the only Nazi Christmas tradition that bizarrely managed to survive the end of World War II. Bones on Okinawa. Bones have been discovered on the Japanese island of Okinawa. The partial skeletons of 8 human beings were excavated from a cave in the city of Itoman. Experts think these people were victims of the Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest in the history of the war. I say one of the bloodiest, but in the Pacific theater it was without a doubt the most violent confrontation. On April 1st, 1945, the United States Marine Corps invaded Okinawa. It was the biggest amphibious assault in the war against the Imperial Japanese Army. The battle lasted 82 days, with the Allies hopping from one island to the next. The plan was to capture the Kadena Air Base and use it as part of Operation Downfall. I think we can all be thankful that Operation Downfall never happened. It was the proposed plan to invade the main Japanese islands at the end of World War II. The operation was only cancelled because of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, prompting the Japanese surrender. If it had come down to a D-Day style attack on the Japanese mainland, there's no telling how the war may have ended. Let's get back to the bodies. The 8 skeletons were found deep in the back of a natural cave. They may have belonged to soldiers with the Japanese army who were using the cave as a bunker. You might be wondering how almost a dozen skeletons can remain missing for more than 75 years. Believe it or not, the remains of dead soldiers are still found somewhat frequently in Okinawa. In the chaos of battle, many fled to whatever remote corners they could find. In the sea caves, soldiers hunkered in wait for the enemy, and many never left the caverns. It looks as if nobody ever entered this cave after the war. Researchers discovered 10 pairs of military boots, buttons from military clothing, a camping pot, and a fountain pen. There's a possibility these people were not soldiers at all, but civilians who were buried in the cave because there wasn't any time to dig real graves. For now, their identities are unknown. The truth behind the disturbing Nazi breeding program. When it comes to breeding, the Germans were the weirdest. Come to think of it, weird might not be the right word. Listen to this insane story and let me know what you think the right word is for Nazi breeding habits. When the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, they immediately started instituting discriminatory policies against people they didn't like. Mostly the Jewish and the Roma peoples, but they weren't fussy. Anybody who wasn't uber-German was discriminated against. One of the most outrageous policies was instituted on December 12, 1935. The Nuremberg laws banned marriage between a German and a Jew. On the same day, the Lebensborn program was initiated in secret by the director of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler. The Lebensborn program was a super creepy Nazi breeding experiment. Heinrich led the initiative himself, recruiting women from the female version of the Hitler Youth, known as the Band of German Maidens. It was like the Nazi version of Girl Scouts, but without the cookies. Any girl who proved their so-called racial purity going back 3 generations was able to participate in the program. The men underwent the same scrutiny. These ideal subjects were then treated like prized breeding stock. They copulated on a timed schedule to maximize the potential of pregnancy. There wasn't anything romantic about it. In fact, it lacked much of what we consider to be human. Soon after the babies were born, they were weaned and given over to Hitler's SS. Then they found their way to special adoption houses spread across occupied Europe. About 20,000 children were born in this way, adopted by German families from one of the 26 facilities. Exact figures are a mystery. The Germans destroyed most of the paper trail before the Allies liberated Europe. What the Allies did learn was that the Nazis were major hypocrites. The Germans had been kidnapping children who looked, as the Nazis put it, racially pure. Then they sent the kidnapped kids to Lebensborn adoption centers. There the kids were indoctrinated to become German. If they couldn't be indoctrinated, they were sent to concentration camps. In 1946, it was estimated that 250,000 children had been kidnapped as part of a plot to strengthen German numbers. And sadly, only around 10% of them ever made it back home. The Soviet bunker frozen in time. In Russia, an urban explorer who goes by the name Xie stumbled upon an abandoned bunker from the Soviet era filled with garbage from World War II. I say garbage, but some might say treasure. The bunker hadn't been touched in years. It was found filled with newspaper clippings, gas masks, and boxes of equipment from the war. I can't tell you exactly where the mysterious bunker was discovered. All I can say based on what Xie told everybody is that he found it near an old factory. The bunker was hidden inside a protective concrete building. Moving into a black corridor and through a huge metal door, Xie found himself in a stuffy room. Then he climbed through a tunnel into an underground bomb shelter. On the walls were old Soviet jackets, as you can see in this picture here straight from Xie's video. The place was a real mess, looking as if it had been abandoned in a real hurry. Do you think you could stomach spending a night in a place as creepy as this? The strange tale of the USS Grayback. The USS Grayback went missing for 75 years. It was only discovered recently thanks to new and impressive undersea drones. The man behind the discovery is Tim Taylor. He and his team of enthusiastic researchers were scouring the seabed off the coast of Japan in search of lost war wrecks. To do this, they used autonomous underwater vehicles, sophisticated drones that can hold their breath for a long time. But they weren't finding much, and Tim was losing hope. His ship was in need of repairs, and his drones, which cost around $7 million apiece, were having issues. Tim was about to pull the plug on the whole mission. It was one of those moments with 1 second left on the clock. Just before Tim gave the word, one of the robots picked up a reading, and there it was, the USS Grayback, resting at a depth of 1,400 feet. It was sitting in the murky gloom like some sort of metal monster. They weren't sure precisely which war machine they had found, not until the drone moved around the bow and to the bridge, where the camera picked up the preserved plaque reading USS Grayback. It was creepy enough to give the researchers tingles up their spines. Although Tim Taylor and his colleagues were excited they'd made the discovery, it was still a sobering experience. The USS Grayback isn't just a broken submarine, it's a war graveyard housing the remains of 80 men. The Grayback's final mission began on January 28, 1944. It left Pearl Harbor to fight the Japanese, successfully sinking about a dozen Japanese ships before it went missing on February 24th. Tim's team were the first people to see the submarine since it vanished. Nobody had known what happened to it, only that the Grayback was gone, and so was everyone in it. The Aryan utopia still alive today. Deep in the jungle of central Paraguay, you will find a town called New Germany. The sign in front of the town, hung from a length of wire attached to a pair of stone towers, reads, "Bienvenidos a Nueva Germania." It's the first thing visitors see when they enter the town that tried to be an Aryan utopia. A utopia is supposed to be a perfect place. The issue with a perfect place is that everybody has a different idea of perfect. What's yours? In the late part of the 19th century, Elizabeth Nietzsche's idea of utopia was one of racial purity. Elizabeth was the sister of somebody you might be familiar with, legendary philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. She believed that Northern European races were superior to all others in the world. She was a believer in Nazi ideology, and so was her husband, Bernhard Forster. Bernhard had already been ostracized in Berlin because of the campaign he launched for racial purity. He lost his job as a teacher for talking about the very same thing Adolf Hitler would shout angrily about from podiums a few years later. But what could have possibly brought them from their homeland to the middle of a jungle in South America? They were attracted to the cheap land. In 1886, Elizabeth and Bernhard finally had enough money to purchase a huge plot of jungle land and start a colony. 14 families joined them, swayed by their racist ideas. They got on a boat and sailed across the Atlantic. The misery set in immediately. It had seemed so romantic when they were planning it. They would get on a boat, spend months voyaging across the sea, and then sail up the Paraná River to their glorious new home. Doesn't that sound exciting? Well, it was exciting for about 30 seconds. Their boat across the Atlantic had rotten food and was infested with cockroaches. I don't know which was worse. When they finally got to Montevideo, they were half-starved and miserable. Then it took them a week to get up the river, all the while being eaten alive by mosquitoes. The pilgrims had bugs laid underneath their skin. It's enough to give you chills. Even before they arrived in Paraguay, they were dropping dead like flies. The so-called superior race hadn't realized what type of climate they were subjecting themselves to. They weren't so tough when they found themselves cooking underneath the hot sun, melting in the humid air, and lying in bed delirious from malaria. Snakes wreaked havoc, biting young children. It was a nightmare, one that had a rather ironic ending. Lydia Fisher is the granddaughter of one of the original settlers. She lives in Germany with her 8 children. Her grandmother was 4 years old when she arrived in Paraguay from Germany with Elizabeth's pilgrims. What language do you think Lydia and her children speak? It certainly isn't German. She speaks a unique dialect of Spanish mixed with the indigenous Guarani language. She still lives in the house where she was born more than 50 years ago. Lydia says the Germans didn't colonize the jungle colonized them. This whole disaster unfolded before World War II, but I thought you'd like to know about it because it shows just how ingrained anti-Semitic and Aryan beliefs were prior to Hitler's rise to power. I should also note that while many of the descendants of the original settlers speak Spanish and married locals, there is a chunk that haven't. Some of them have been marrying amongst themselves and keeping their Nazi ideologies alive for more than 100 years. What are your thoughts on the Aryan paradise still being around in 2024? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and come back soon for more amazing videos from the channel.